everyone. Welcome back. It is February 19th, 2020, and you're listening to episode 7 of the Mid-Season Replacements podcast. I am your host, Randy Dankievitch, the man behind TV Never Sleeps and the TV editor of GoombaStop.com. And with me, a man with a lifetime license to ill, Sean Colletti. What's up, Sean?
It's one of the best introductions I've ever been given.
That's what I'm here for. Yeah, shows coming. You may have noticed if you checked your feed this morning that we didn't have an episode come out last night. That's because I was deathly sick over the weekend. Not to the point where I'm actually dead, but, close enough that at points I was hoping for death. But on that depressing note, welcome to the show this week. We're going to talk about we're going to talk about a few of Hulu's comedies. Not all of them. We're not going to talk about what we consider the best one, nor what we consider to be the worst one. We're going to talk about the three in the middle because I think they all line up in really interesting ways, but we'll get into that. First of all, do a little housekeeping. Our opening song that you may have heard is called Curtains. It was written by Ryan Elliott, who is in the band Ancient Fears. You can find them on Facebook, Bandcamp, Spotify, all the cool places that musicians are in 2020. I don't think they're on MySpace, which when I was a musician, that's where you put your music if you wanted people to listen to. But
oh my God.
I think that ages myself just a little bit.
We can't do that. We're timeless. We're ageless.
That's right. If you'd like to reach the show, of course, our email address is midseasonreplacements@gmail.com. Questions, concerns, music you want to hear on the show, corrections, everything's welcome. We can also be found on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, all those places. Just search the Mid-Season Replacements. Give us a follow. Leave us a review. We love that stuff. If you want to follow us on the internet itself, I guess the official internet, not just music internet. Boy, I'm really on one today. The show's at Mid-Season Pod on Twitter. I'm at RJ Dank. And then the site can be found at Goomba Stomp with a 0 on the last O. Yeah, that's where we can be found. That's how to find us. So let's just get right into it. We're going to talk about 2 through 4 on our unofficial, semi-ambiguous Hulu comedy rankings. Those shows are Shrill, High Fidelity, and Dollface, I guess, which are kind of the 3 most recent that have had seasons on Hulu. The other 2 are Rami, which I guess we can say is the one we consider the best of the group, and then Pen 15, which I don't know if worst is the right word, but maybe the least of the group is probably the way to frame that.
Yeah, worst isn't the right word. It's more, it's such a cringe comedy that skews towards, at least for me, and maybe for other people who aren't good with cringe comedy, overshadowing its comedy with its cringe. That I saw the first 2 episodes and I just found it difficult to get into. And I think there's probably a lot of people out there who either already really love the show or who would really love the show. And this is just a case of it's not for me.
I think those 2 shows, when they air, they both have new seasons airing later this year, so I'm sure it'll come up on another show. But I think Shrill, High Fidelity, and Dollface all kind of line up very neatly. So I'm going to pick an arbitrary order for us to talk about these in. Let's start with the most recent one. Let's talk about High Fidelity, which, for those who are unfamiliar, is I guess to use music terms, it's a remix of the 2000 film. John Cusack starred as a guy who ran a record store and was able to afford an apartment in the middle of Chicago, which not realistic anymore, let's be honest with ourselves. So instead, this time we have a person who runs a kind of unsuccessful music store who can afford to live in Brooklyn. Also interesting, but that's not what we're here to talk about. Is the realism of the settings of these shows. High Fidelity is one of those shows where you can see the elevator pitch for it. Like, hey, what if we made High Fidelity but starred a woman? And hey, what if we use Lisa Bonet's daughter because she was in the original series? Like, it feels like a product of a marketing meeting that Hulu had and was like, oh shit, this is an easy one to do. But I do think that as the series goes on, it finds ways to validate its existence. But we haven't really talked about it off air, so I'm curious as to how you feel about it. I've written a review, which you can find on Goomba Stomp already, So I'm curious, Sean, what you thought of High Fidelity, kind of in a broad sense.
You used the word remix, and I think trying to figure out what the best term is part of how I would try to respond to High Fidelity, whether that's adaptation, reimagining. This is a conversation that gets used a lot, mostly in film, especially with film franchises where you reboot, which is another word that gets thrown there. So having just seen the film for the first time, so that was part of my homework in preparing for this podcast because I hadn't seen it because I live under a rock. Um, this series is definitely to me an adaptation. The only, I think, exchange that you and I had off air was a message where you said that you used the word slavish, and I think maybe that's not even enough to get at like how closely this follows the film. So
Especially early on.
yeah, and I guess so. There's that. It does it in a way though where I feel like it makes the film redundant. So it does everything that the film does and has the opportunity to make its side characters more three-dimensional. So it's like a better version of the film. So that's why I think that it makes it redundant. But as an adaptation, it's so close to the material that I feel like even though it's the better of the two for me, like why make this? Why adapt this so closely? Are there a lot of people who saw the film High Fidelity and thought, I want to see basically this same thing again, just a little bit longer? Like, these are the kinds of questions that I always wonder about with adaptation, because for me, I never want to see the same thing that I just saw or that I just read or that I just listened to, whatever a creative is adapting from. I know there are some people who do. So I think that's probably more common in young adult stuff or genre stuff where somebody creates such a vivid world that you kind of just want to see it on the screen rather than imagining it yourself because there's something really fun and intoxicating about that. I think that's a big reason why the Harry Potter films are so successful. But when it comes to something like this, where the film High Fidelity doesn't fall into that category, why are you choosing to adapt this? And if you are adapting it, how are you making it different? How are you doing it in a way that has, where the creator has their own vision? To me, a good adaptation ought to be more an interpretation, because if you're just remaking something the same way as the original, that I guess that ultimately seems like a pointless task. It's really
Well, it's the whole like Gus Van Sant psycho theory, right? Like, can you do an exact homage to something and give it its own meaning, or does it end up just feeling like a pale imitation?
and this absolutely feels like an imitation, not a pale one. I think it's a good one. I think the things that I liked about the film, I like slightly more in this series. So I enjoyed both. Uh, but I don't really get it. Like, why make that creative decision? And there are articles out there that I think are trying to claim that this does enough things different from the film, but to me, so many of those things are just superficial, surface level stuff. To me, the impact, what this is going for thematically, I don't think that it does enough. That would be my first response.
Yeah, I think the first four and a half ish episodes in particular are so identical to the beats of the original film that it's almost hard to get invested in any of it. Right away you can tell that Zoe Kravitz is, she's a fantastic actress. She embodies the role in a really interesting way and definitely gives it a different energy than Cusack's character. And I think that's an intentional, creative choice to make her character a bit distinct. But then they just kind of plop her into the exact same world with the exact same characters. And I think it takes a full 7 or 8 episodes before the show realizes that its characters can be something else besides, like you said, the superficial differences they make. Oh, Rob's a woman who's still named Rob. Wow. Oh, or her ex-boyfriend that she works with is actually gay. Wow. Oh, they made Jack Black a black woman. Wow. Like, I don't know. It feels like the show wants to pat itself on the back before it's actually done anything to accomplish that. And I do think there are moments where the show does start to move away from its, what it is adapting, but I think it comes too far too late. There are moments, though, that early on when they do try to shift away where it just kind of feels hollow. I think in particular, what I'm thinking of is the whole arc they have with, basically Zoe Kravitz and the arc she has with her mother's character from the film, the musician who comes in on tour and is kind of this elusive fantasy that Rob gets to engage with, the banging a music star who's also banged other music stars. And it's kind of the closest Rob gets to fucking their own records in either adaptation. I think it's a small note, but it's one that frustrates me. They replace that really awesome Lisa Bonet cover that they did in the original with the fucking white boy version of a Boys to Men song, which I think was the first sign from, not the first sign, but the one of the early telling signs for me that, where they are choosing to make adaptations and choices to this are not necessarily where I would do them, nor would they be the choices I would find interesting. Because that character, I think, is kind of a really hollow imitation of what Lisa Bonet's character was in the film. And I think ultimately, like, the last two episodes of this season show that this series actually has very different ends than what the film is reaching for. I think the film does a lot of interesting things and is very subtle about how it treats Rob as a shitty character and why he's a shitty human being. And even the ending that movie has, where he realizes that he needs to be accepting of other people's flaws, I think he goes about it in a really fucking garbage, toxic way. And I think that movie's ending shows that, like, I would argue that movie's thesis, the thesis of the film is kind of that, like, shitty people will settle and they deserve to have that shitty, quote unquote, happy ending for themselves, where they're always going to be questioning whether it's an ending they deserve or not. And I think the reason that works so well is because it is a film and that is the ending and that is the end of when we see that character. But being a TV show, they kind of have to change that, because not only would it make a second season of this utterly miserable to watch, unless it took place like 30 years later and they turned it into some like Linklaters Before trilogy and treated it something like that. But you can't really do that with a TV show. So I think the changes that it does try to make in the end with like are ultimately kind of baffling. I think some of the stuff with Rob and her and self-acceptance works, but like, the whole scene of Charisse playing the guitar by herself and having her music performance by herself is just a dumb change. Like, I just find it very stupid that they would make that, because like in the film, the whole Jack Black moment at the end of the movie is like almost validating. Like, we put up with this character shit for the entire movie because holy shit, they actually have some talent. They have something to offer that Rob as a character doesn't recognize until that moment, when it connects to his like love of music and his asinine way of like filtering using music as a filter to define his entire life. Like, it's the only way he can see people that have value. And Charisse performing that song by herself where nobody can see it and nobody recognizes it kind of feels more like an empty gesture towards making a new storyline than actually anything of substance. I don't know. I'm wondering, that decision is probably the strangest one out of the entire series, and I'm wondering how you felt about it.
Charisse really needed her own episodes in the same way that Simon got his, and I thought that that's what they were setting up with some of the last few episodes. I liked the Jack Black character. Like is the wrong word, of course. Like, I was entertained by that performance and what they did with that character in the film, and I felt the same way with Charisse in this one. Like, it's somebody who is just kind of fun to be around, sometimes in really annoying ways, sometimes in really wonderful ways. And they only kind of just started. I should stop saying they, or at least give context. So the series is developed by Veronica West and Sarah. I'm gonna mess this up.
Kucerka?
Yeah,
that'll be my guess.
I'm so sorry.
Sorry, Sarah.
So it felt like maybe they were holding a little bit back, and maybe we'll get more of the Charisse storyline in the second season. I agree that the impact of how they adapted that scene in particular felt a little bit off. And yeah, just ultimately, I was wondering why we got the Simon episode that begins with a scene that we've already seen, and we see what the rest of Rob's evening is like after that. And I thought, oh, we're getting Simon's in this one, which was wonderful. That was a great episode. And not getting the Shrill one was a little bit confusing.
So the Simon episode is, I'm of two minds of this. Like, I love this whole episode that focuses on Simon, but kind of got a hot take on this.
Okay, let's do it.
I'm fucking tired of this trend that we have now where series are so insularly focused on one or two characters or three characters that the only time they can find room for characterization is by dedicating one entire episode to another character. I think in spots and on certain shows it works well, but I think as kind of a developing trend and as what's becoming a trope, I think it's a lazy way to characterize somebody. Because if you want to make somebody a character, make them a character for the entire season. Don't give them space to define themselves within one 30-minute segment of the entire season. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because like Simon through most of the season is just kind of there. He's kind of the gay token dude that's like, the only connection he really has to the series is that like, oh, he's Rob's ex-boyfriend who showed up to work and didn't leave. I mean, there's a whole other conversation we could have about Rob's past relationships, like the whole, oh, I was a lesbian for 10 minutes thing. Like, I'm a bisexual, but I only date men through the entire show and only show interest in men, except for in this one flashback. I think that's a whole other conversation that I don't know if I'm really, as a fucking cis-ass, hetero-ass white dude, I may not be qualified for. But the Simon thing bugs me because it almost feels like a nod towards giving a gay character presence on a show, but then kind of abandoning that for the rest of the season. And it just falls. It's the same thing that not every show does it with a gay character, but it always does it with a character. Like every prestige show that runs between 10 and 15 episodes will do this at some point or another.
Yeah. So where I think shows do this well is when we have seen this character in the ensemble up until that point, have our impressions of them. Then we get this episode that challenges those impressions, and then the episodes that come after, we kind of look at that character in much different ways. And there weren't enough episodes after this where we could kind of see Simon in a new light. So am I tired of the trope? I'm probably not yet, because I understand it from a creative perspective, and I'm sure that you do as well. But there probably are better workarounds for that, like figuring out ways in all the other episodes to make every character as interesting as they need to be. But I do, even though it doesn't really bother me with High Fidelity, I agree that it wasn't done in that way where other series do them well. Like what comes after with Simon, the scenes that we get after that episode with him, there's not really enough of me using the information that I got in that episodes to kind of reassess him and what he's going through and how it relates to everything that's going on with Rob. And that might just be, an issue of quantity, that there weren't enough episodes following that it came quite late in the season. I'm not sure. Yeah.
The one other thing I wanted to highlight in particular that will definitely come up when we talk about Shrill, and it's another trend that I notice in series, is that a lot of series that are focused on one character's point of view, these not semi-autobiographical stories, but, they're creative biographies kind of focusing on one character and their journey through life and whatnot. And there's always the episode where it kind of all falls apart and everything becomes a crisis. And I've noticed that shows, like I just said, Shrill did this, where that is hinged on the fact that our protagonist is a very selfish person in some way. And I kind of feel like it's hard to really portray that honestly. I think Shrill does kind of a bad job of it, honestly, in the episode that it does that. And I think High Fidelity might come the closest to doing a good job because it does give Rob these different shades of a person and doesn't It doesn't spend a lot of time trying to over-explain her good qualities or her bad qualities. It just kind of presents them and works with them in these 10 episodes. But there's the episode when she goes to, it's her 30th birthday and everybody shits on her and tells her how selfish she is. And I gotta wonder, like, isn't it kind of inherent in the construction of, like, the creative construction of these shows as a whole? Like, they are supposed to be selfish shows. They're kind of about this period that everybody goes through in like their mid to late 20s where they have to look at themselves and be like, holy shit, I'm not the person I was when I'm 18 anymore. What does that mean? And I don't know. I struggle with whether that's actually a selfish endeavor or whether it's just easy to frame it as a selfish endeavor. You know, because we all have to have that kind of moment of self-reflection and self-reckoning with where we have to accept our own flaws and maybe you realize that, hey, this part of my personality is kind of shitty. Can I change that? Or is that just kind of an inherent thing that everybody has?
Mm.
And every show seems to frame it as the character's fault. But I think sometimes that comes across as dishonest to me. I think High Fidelity actually does a pretty good job of it because of, the history of Rob's relationship with her ex-fiance, whose
Mac.
name is Mac. Yes. Kingsley Benadiran, one of the more underrated performances on the show. But I don't know. It's just one of those things I think about now when it happens on these shows. Because, like I said, we'll talk about when Shrill does it and why I don't think it works there. But it feels like they're substituting an actual character trait or misunderstanding a character trait as something that just every human goes through and then trying to force it into a show as a framing device.
Yeah, I think the series' exploration of Rob and her selfishness was at times better than the film and at other times not quite as good. I don't think, I don't know about you and how you view your role as critic. When I talk about not just a series, a film, a book, whatever, or when I write about it, I don't feel like it's my job to look at how successfully it does something socially. And if I were to look at that, then I think the superficial adaptation of just turning Rob into a female character, like you have to give it a lot of credit for the way that it does that. How this deals with representation versus the film is obviously way, way better. But again, I don't see that as my role, commenting on that in any way. When I come to something, like I feel like for me, what I get out of it in assessing it and what I feel like my job is to look at it creatively. And so where I think it does something better and not as good as the film, two examples of that, or one of each, are a result of just that superficial flip. So looking at, so keeping the infidelity in this, which they take a while to get to, so that it's kind of like a key moment in the back half of the season. I really enjoyed that creatively because this is something that's stereotypically a male thing, a male experience, where the male is the one who cheats on the partner, and whether the POV character is the female onto who that's been done, or the male who's trying to deal with being a shitty person. Like that's typically how it's been explored, and so I really liked that we got that as a result of the decision, the very basic decision just to make Rob female, where I think it didn't work quite as well, and where I felt like the writers were maybe having their cake and eating it, was in dealing with Rob's snobbery as a music aficionado and a critic. So like that's a huge negative in the film. Like all three of those employees to some degree come off as assholes about in the ways that they talk about music with other people. They're very obviously snobs, and the film has fun with that and makes fun of them for that. And there are a lot of moments in the series where that's done as well. But the moment when Rob in the series is being condescended to by the guy who owns this David Bowie print of The Man Who Sold the World. I felt like that they got to change Rob's gender and had an opportunity to, again, flip the script and have a female character embody a very stereotypically male trait, which is, mansplaining, talking about a thing in this way, where like you have to prove your knowledge about something to even be like socially accepted into the circle. And in that scene at the bar, that's what happened to Rob, even though she's the one who possesses that information and should be able to do that and ought to do that to other characters. And that was obviously the point, is that, even for somebody who has all this information, who is an elitist for sure, but also a very educated person on this topic, that because she's a woman, she's still talked down to. Like, again, socially, that's absolutely wonderful. Creatively, like, I found that a weak adaptation of that character trait, and I wish that they could have just made her an asshole when it came to that part of her character.
Yeah, how the show treats Rob's relationship with music in the TV show is it has the same beats as the film, but I feel like the overall tone of it is very different. Like, Rob in the film is very much defined by his musical taste. Like, he doesn't accept anybody who doesn't have the same musical taste. He can't accept anybody because he doesn't think their musical tastes are as good and as varied as his. And I feel like Rob on the TV show is kind of like more of a timid music historian. Like, she has her preferences and her, I want to say her prejudices, but I don't know if that's really the right word. She, like any of us that work in criticism or are super fans of creative art, like, we have the things that we enjoy, we have the things we don't enjoy, and I think the show plays it a little subtler with her, at least when it comes to how she defines herself as a person. And I think it does take a little bit of bite out of that scene and makes it kind of feel like a slightly hollow feminist statement, like kind of the superficial thing that I think some of the other shows we talk about do a little too often.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that scene does kind of stand out as being kind of an opportunity where they could embrace like Rob's literary history, being the book or the film, as kind of being an asshole and embrace it a little bit more, just to give her a little bit of a sharper edge. Because I don't know, you can tell Zoe Kravitz is so talented and just so naturally embodies this role that they could have. The moments when they push her to extremes is really fascinating. The end of the second episode when she loses her shit, or the end of the entire arc of the ninth episode and how the different emotions she has to portray. I think she's fantastic, and I just wish in scenes like that they would have embraced it more.
I'm gonna make a slight turn to just talk about something else that's part of this series and the film. Anything that is so immersed in music and music culture, I think, already sets itself up for a huge challenge, which is how to use the soundtrack. Because we already come to art having listened to a lot of these songs and already have in our heads contexts in which we remember them, ways that we feel about them, and it's so difficult to incorporate them into films and TV and to recontextualize them so that either we associate them with this new thing, or that it's so powerfully used that we kind of forget our previous relationships with those. And I don't know if I've seen anything that genuinely does it really well, that has a soundtrack that's all music composed by artists that we know and manages to fit them in at the right moment, for the right effect. And it's something that's obviously a huge part of High Fidelity, and some of them work better than others, and some of them just seem way too obvious and a bit shoved in there to kind of hammer points home that we kind of already get. So the lyrics match up thematically, which is what all of these really ought to be doing, but maybe it's so neat and so obvious that I felt like but then I don't understand like the work that has to go into that, to finding the right songs, to making them logical. Like that must be such a headache, and I guess it's a positive reaction. I know a lot of that sounds negative, but I think a lot of other shows might have done much worse in terms of doing the obvious choices, and letting the music do all the heavy lifting for the writing. And even though I felt like there were times when it was doing that, it was less often, I guess, than I thought it would be.
So the movie very much has that, like, it's a hangover of the mid to late, well, I'd say early to late 90s, like indie dramedy vibe when soundtracks kind of defined your film in a lot of ways. And I think this series kind of feels more. There are a lot of times where I feel like this version of High Fidelity is like if 2016 MTV adapted it, or just even it really just post like 2002 MTV adapted it, where they're kind of just flinging music all over the place and like, oh, you know this, and oh, this would be cool, and maybe some tits here. Like, I don't know, man. Like, we're into music. Aren't you into music? Let's be into music together. And I feel like it kind of has that energy at times where it's just kind of throwing shit against the wall
Mm-hmm.
that is both obvious and also at times too obscure for its own good. Um, yeah, the music on the show is very interesting. It's something that, like, if I really wanted to dig into it, I would have to, I've only watched these episodes once. I'd want to dig into this stuff a little bit more. And, I rewatched the film, but it was the first time I'd seen the film in 15 years. So I couldn't recite the soundtrack to you by name or anything. I think I had speaking of John Cusack movies, I think I had the Grosse Point Blank soundtrack at some point in my life. I'll have to check back through my CDs. But anyway, speaking of 90s films that, like, rely on their soundtracks a lot. But yeah, I think that's kind of all I have to say about High Fidelity. I think it's a show that has such a fantastic lead that I wish it took that energy and captured it in the rest of the series. And I think it does in moments, especially towards the end. But I think, like you said, the slavishness that it has to the original in the first 5 or 6 episodes is just so overbearing. It reduces anything that, any investment you can have in those last 4 episodes until it's over and you're like, oh shit, some of that was actually really good. Like, I think Jake Lacey's character, what is his name? Clyde. Really good character, really good supporting character who gets to be defined, but doesn't overextend his presence, but serves a very important integral purpose in the show. I think they did a really good job with his character. But, I look at characters like, Charisse for most of it, or, even Simon for a lot of it, and it just kind of feels like an imitation at the end of the day.
Because I don't want to get to the other 2 shows, I'll kind of just very quickly do my last points on High Fidelity. I hope I'm crediting the right person for this. I just pulled it up on IMDb. The series costume design is by Sarah Lau, Laux. It throughout the costuming in this series is absolutely wonderful. The one that just like really sticks in my mind is from episode 5 when Rob's wearing the Dickies t-shirt on top of that green skirt. Like it felt like such an iconic outfit, and that's the one that I remember most. But all of the t-shirts and everything that was used in this, I think, were really great. Also, that episode had Parker Posey in an absolutely fantastic role. This is a stupid comment, but I wish that people would stop using Vivaldi, like that piece, to associate it with like this high, rich culture, because like that's the impression that the first movement of that gives off. But like if you listen to the rest of it, and it's like over a 20-minute piece, like it's much more than that. That's a very stupid, nitpicky thing. Also, do people actually pay $8.50 for a coffee anywhere in America? Because that's fucking ridiculous.
I was in New York last year, and I didn't pay any more for coffee than I do here in Maine, to be honest. I mean, it may be $1 more. It's not like buying cigarettes in New York or something where it's like, hey, you want a pack of cigarettes? Give me $15, It's not like that, That's for sure. But yes, that definitely did stick out. I had one more thing I wanted to note, and now I forgot it. So, oh, yeah. For people who didn't catch it, the Beastie Boys reference at the beginning of the show was because she wears a Beastie Boys shirt in like the second episode. And that's when I was like, okay, I can get on board with Rob, which I know is a fucking lame way to do that, but it's the little things sometimes, you know?
Definitely.
But I do agree the costuming is great. So, High Fidelity, I think, I mean, if you like the film, you might like this. I don't know. It's kind of hard to find. That was the thing at the end of the day when I was writing my review, and it was like, who do I recommend this show to? Will music lovers get a lot out of it? It's hard to say that because music in 2020, there's just so fucking much of it that it's hard to pin down, like, hey, you're going to really get something out of this. As a character piece, I don't know. Like, I just don't. It's not like a definitive feminist piece, or it's not a definitive piece of anything, really. You know, it's just kind of another adaptation. I think it's got interesting elements, but I guess the one thing that plays into its favor is that every episode is less than, I think the longest episode's 34 minutes, which certainly makes it easier to watch. But if you were to ask me to find the audience to recommend this show to, I would not know.
I mean, yeah, all I could say is that if you liked the film, I would be shocked if you didn't like the series as well.
Yeah. So I think the next show I want to go to, because I think the parallels to them are vast, is Shrill, which just aired its second season in sometime in January. I don't remember the date exactly.
24th.
January 24th, so about 2 weeks before High Fidelity. And for those who aren't familiar, Shrill, another comedy on Hulu, obviously, duh. Kind of loosely based on Lindy West's memoir collection, Shrill Notes from a Loud Woman. It stars SNL's Adie Bryant and a bunch of other familiar faces. It's kind of of all of these comedies, I think this might be the one that is considered the highest prestige, if there's such a phrase. High Fidelity was originally a Disney series, so it kind of had that backing behind it. But, this show, the executive producers include Lorne Michaels and Elizabeth Banks, for Christ's sake. So this is obviously a more prestige show. But I think that it and High Fidelity have a lot in common because they are both shows with great leads. They are both shows that have scatterbrained ideas about what their show is actually about. And I think ultimately that kind of lack of consistent focus kind of robs the show of some of its ability to have an emotional impact. And I also think it's a show that has floaty secondary characters that only get definition when we give them specific episodes. I don't know, Sean. Tell me like we did with the last show, what is your broad feeling of Shrill?
My broad one? Oh, so much easier to do specific. I'll try for broad. I glanced at some of the reviews for the second season of this, and it seemed like people were a little bit less keen than in the first season. It did get a slightly higher episode order, but it seemed like for the most part it had to do with shifting the focus of the series. So whereas season one deals a lot, not entirely, but a lot with Annie's weight, the second season puts that to the side for the most part, and there's just a lot of other things going on. And the way that some of the reviews talked about that made it seem like a negative, and I both agree and disagree, because I feel like, at the very least, Annie and Fran really anchor this series, and there's a lot of Fran stuff in this season that I really love. The wedding.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it a better season is Fran becomes an actual character, and it gives the show, because without that, it's like the only other character is Luka Jones's Ryan, and if that's your second character on a show, you're fucked.
That's true.
I mean, that dude's I feel bad for that dude. He's been playing the same character for like 7 years. He was the like signature Zach Galifianakis post Hangover ripoff character that every network comedy wanted to do for like a half decade, and it just boggles my fucking mind that this character even exists on this show. Anyway, we can get to that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's fine. And he's very good at doing that. But you're right. Like, if that is your second character, that's not good. And this second season very clearly presented the case that Fran is that second character. And the wedding episode is fantastic. And then once we get back to more Annie-centric stuff, well, I say Annie-centric, the Waham episode has so much rich thematic stuff. And it seems like a lot of the stuff in that episode, which is directed by Natasha Lyonne, that episode has a lot of what Shrill's trying to do at large. And I think the episode is definitely a success. That's a wonderful episode from this season, but I think the whole season, it just felt like it was executing really well. So I was a bit confused with the reaction to this. I liked the first season, not a whole lot, but enough to watch the second season, and I felt a relief and justification for sticking with it because even if there are some storylines that aren't quite as good as some of the stronger ones in this season, the 8 episodes versus the 6 episodes, it just felt like there was more to enjoy with the second season.
And I think, I don't usually like to kind of point directly to the source material for these things. We barely talked about the High Fidelity book, but I've read some of the essays from Shrill, Notes from a Loud Woman, and I do think that like the first season feels like it's very much focused on the couple essays in that book that are very much about fat acceptance and fat shaming and all that kind of stuff. But the second season feels more like a collection of stories, and I think that's what ultimately, that and the increased prominence of Fran, makes this second season so much more interesting to me. There's more stuff about corporate dynamics and the idea of male feminism, and with Waham the idea of monetizing feminism that I think Lindy West in particular is an extremely sharp mind when it comes to. She's one of the people, a lot of people in like 2013 to 2015 left Twitter out of harassment. She was one of them, and I think her presence is very much missed on that platform sometimes. I don't blame her because of the harassment she got, but I think her points of view on that kind of stuff are very interesting. It's the stuff on that, it's the ancillary stuff about that series that kind of bugs me. Her parents are vague, or too vague to be as prominent as they are sometimes. Like the big reveal in the first season finale is that her mom left town to go to Vancouver for a few days, which is kind of a thing in season 2. Like she's mad at her mom for a couple episodes, but it's not really a thing. It's weird. The pacing of this show is kind of all over the place, but I think in the second season, as a collection of stories, it's allowed to be like that. I think structurally it can be a little more freewheeling. But I do think that I think my biggest complaint with the show is that Ryan is way too much of a presence through these 2 seasons. I think the where the show ultimately ends up at the end of season 2, where she finally dumps or wherever in season 2 where she finally dumps the dude, is like something that should have happened in the first 3 episodes. Because like I think we can understand that she is putting herself and trying to tolerate a toxic relationship in a much shorter window than we are given. Like, they drag this dude's fucking lame story out and his lame roommates. Now they all use their mom's car. And, it just feels like an empty... they're trolling a group of people that were basically non-existent when television wanted to troll them 6 years ago. So to use that as kind of a straw man, when there's so many other, like, potent examples of, like, empty masculinity on the show. I think, while I think we could argue whether John Cameron Mitchell's casted well as Annie's boss Gabe, I think, like his hair and his character are kind of fucking ridiculous and pointless. Like there's a whole episode about a party that they have where he's like all worried about his job, and the owner of the I thought it was a website, but it's a newspaper that they actually work for. I'm still very confused about what their actual publication is. Because it's like a monthly paper where they have delivery drivers, but they also count hits on a website. Very confusing. But anyway, there's an episode where they have a party at his house that's kind of trying to focus itself on her a little bit, on him a little bit more, and I just think it comes off as kind of dumb and hollow. And then, like even characters like Amadi, he's just fucking shapeless. Like he's literally just a dude who's there to have plot points attached to him. Like he just kind of shrugs the whole time. He's like, huh, well, I guess I got promoted. Huh, well, I guess this promotion sucks. Huh, well, I guess I got to do HR training. Like, I don't understand the point of his character. Like, Annie, Fran are great. I think the one other presence on the show that I really enjoy is Ruthie, but that's also because, like, I am quickly becoming a diehard Patty Harrison fan. I think she's phenomenal. People who have watched I Think You Should Leave, she's the one who does the early Christmas gift with the copier sketch in the office, and it's one of my favorites. And I think she brings that same energy to this role. I think it's really fun. I even think there's really touching notes with her character, like when the episode with the party, I think, ends up being a stronger episode about Ruthie and her character than it does about Annie or Gabe or anybody else that's at that party, ultimately. And it just... A.D. Bryant is so good on this show, and when this show focuses on her character and the different aspects of it, of her trying to figure out her presence in the world, is really interesting. But I think the show sidetracks itself with too many uninteresting characters to ultimately have like a lasting impact at the end of
On A.D. Bryant, there's just one tick that really bothers me, and I don't know if this is an aspect of the writing or if it's of the performance. It's a way of speaking in really elliptical patterns where sentences will just end with so dot dot dot. It's like
It's very twee.
it is, and it bothers me to the point where like I started to really notice it, and I tend not to notice those things. I think so. It's obviously a personality thing for that character, um, but it almost felt like a lack of confidence in the dialogue. I'm not 100% married to that idea, and I'd have to think more about it, but it was something that jumped out. And I don't think it's possible to overstate how incredible Patty Harrison is on this show in this role as Ruthie, who is
I almost wish the show was about her instead of Annie.
she is this agent of chaos in such an incredible, convincing way where I'm just excited, genuinely excited by any scene in which she's a part. It's it's a kind of character. If you've not seen Shrill, but you've seen Parks and Recreation, late into Parks and Rec's run, Craig gets introduced. His first trait is just yelling very loudly at people, and you don't know what to expect anytime that Craig's in a scene. And Ruthie operates, I think, in a similar way, and Patty Harrison just does it absolute fire. I'd also want to shout out Joe Firestone, who plays Maureen, who is another worker at the Thorn. And some people might know her from Joe Pera Talks With You. She plays Sarah on that series. But that's also, like Ruthie and like Ryan, these ought to be secondary characters, and I know Shrill plays up Ryan to be slightly more than that, but relatively two-dimensional. Like they're very good at what they do, and I think even though Maureen isn't quite as stupendous and just wonderful to watch as Ruthie is, I think she's very good.
Well, I think she also comes in, she doesn't really show up till like halfway through the second season, so they don't give her a lot of time. She does have one, like my favorite scene of hers is the scene she has with Connor O'Malley's character, where it's revealed that they're hooking up inside the office as well. Like an office hookup becomes a big plot line, and like, I mean, we could spend an entire episode talking about the calamity of that episode. Like, that episode is kind of a really, really a hot mess when it comes to like how it's looking at sexual harassment and just sexual identity in general. It's a very weird episode. But her comedic touch works really well. The more I think about it, the more I just wish this show had adjusted its cast a little bit more. Like, I think if you took Joel Kim Booster, who's kind of a minor character, I think he plays Gabe's husband or something. I forget who his character even is, but he shows up on the show. He's the dude who's a kind of a rich prick all the time with the bowl cut. He was on Undeclared earlier this year too. But I think if he was Gabe, I think I might like the show better. Like him and Patty Harrison would give. Like, I think if you want to satirize the online content mill industry, like they kind of like poke at every now and then. I think if you kind of harness those two energies a little bit more instead of Gabe's like shitty white elitist non-feminism, like just bullshit we've already seen before, I think it would give that workplace comedy element of the show a little bit more energy, which I think it really, really needs sometimes, especially when we get scene after scene of what's his name? Amadi just kind of staring at people, like just blankly staring. Like at one point, some character goes to him and is like, "Your wife only fucks you when she's drunk and you're making money," and he's just like, "Oh, this is not about me right now." and they just drop that and it never becomes a thing again. And I was like, what the fuck is happening on this show? So like, I feel like this could be, this could be Hulu's signature comedy if it needs so many, like if there was 50 dials in front of me, if I was, the young thug meme of him like intently staring at the Pro Tools on the screen, like if you just shifted a couple of these dials like in very drastic ways, I think this would be an amazing show. I think there are times, like you said, with the pool party episode, with the Wham episode, that this show is legitimately great. But I think the rest of it is just so scatterbrained and so inconsistent. And like you said, with I think your point about the secondary characters being very two dimensional, that it kind of robs this show of its impact. The wedding episode works. I think the wedding episode, in contrast to the Simon episode on High Fidelity, I think I really like the wedding episode because it is an episode that distinctly focuses on another character, but it doesn't feel like it's isolating them from the rest of the show because it's the only way it knows how to tell its story. Like it would be very easy to take the black queer woman on the show and, we got to isolate her to be able to understand her as a person. But, she goes to this wedding and Annie's with her and she has to kind of try and interpret and understand the family dynamic. And I think that gives it a richness and keeps it within the show's reality, that it just helps. It really helps her character. And kind of the show, when it has those two characters on screen, blossom in ways that I don't think High Fidelity really ever gets to do.
No, that episode's a great example of what we were talking about. That comes about halfway through the season. You have ideas of who Fran is, and that just colors in so many different things, and you just have a much better relationship with that character for the rest of the season.
Yeah, so ultimately, I think I like Shrill. I think I do. I just wish that the pieces I liked of it were spread out more, that they took up larger chunks of the whole of what this series is. But I do think the second season, as it begins to focus more on the different characters in the workplace, Annie, Patty Harrison's character goes from being a recurring role to being a regular, and I think that really helps give this show some energy when it needs it. First season makes a lot of very relevant points that other television shows haven't tried to make, but it does it. It's not quite as preachy as This Is Us about this particular character and weight issues and how society views these things. But I do think it does get a bit soapboxy and tries to explain things to us a bit. I think the second season, especially with the Wham episode, feels a little more natural in how it tries to express itself and its ideas.
Yeah, I think this is the most accessible of the three series we're talking about, but it's not my favorite.
Which leads us to the series that is not my favorite of these three.
And it is my favorite.
Dollface. That is the only one of these three shows that didn't premiere this year. The first season premiered in November. It was just renewed for a second season, though, in January. Another female-focused series. This indie, dramedy, female-centric series is kind of what Hulu is building its comedy brand on, which I'm all for it. This series is easily the most surrealist of all these series. It is about a woman who gets dumped after a long-time boyfriend and has to find her identity again, which, to disclose some personal things, I have been dumped after a 5-year relationship in the middle of nowhere where none of my friends are and nobody I know, I have no family around me, and I have to kind of go back and reconnect with myself and the people that I love and all that kind of stuff. I wasn't isolated by my partner at the time. It was just a matter of I moved to fucking Utah with them. So, like, there is a part of this series that I really, really relate to. I just think that the magic realism of the series doesn't work, and ultimately it is used to kind of cover for a shallowness of ideas that, I don't know, I haven't seen every episode of the show. I'll admit that I haven't seen all 10 episodes, but what I have seen, it feels like those moments are obfuscating the show's kind of horizontal view on, kind of one axis view on what individual feminism is.
Okay.
As a guy who's talking about feminism, do you agree with me?
Okay. In terms of the magic realism, so I've gone on record, this is just me talking tangentially, I feel very much like Charles Barkley, who starts one sentence and moves on to a bunch of other sentences. I've gone on record on this podcast saying that I've had issues with other series, namely Fleabag, their use of heightened
Ooh, hot
reality,
takes.
right? Heightened reality, very different from magical realism, and I think I get on way better with this. So if a series is trying to portray its world as mostly realistic, that has some absurdist humor thrown in that kind of plays with that a little bit, that to me is more difficult to pull off than something like Dollface, which really embraces its magic realism. I think the only issue I have with it really was the use of Beth Grant as the cat lady, which felt like it was kind of a fun decision in the pilot, and they kind of just ran with it. I gotta stop saying they. This series was created by Jordan Weiss, and this is her first like real project as a creative. I think she did an episode of TV before this or after this. I should be looking at the IMDb page. I'm sorry, but this is like her first real thing to do as a creative unto herself, and that decision. So having the cat lady, who's done really well by Beth Grant, that's the first instance of magical realism that we get, and we've come back to that character a few times throughout the season, but that's the only one, just because of kind of how cute and ridiculous it is, that grates just a little bit. Everything else, which are these asides where Jules will be shopping for a rebound guy at a car dealership. So instead of cars, you have these guys next to these cars, but she's actually looking and testing out these guys, or the Wizard of Oz episodes, or any of these other things. Game show, she's dragged into a game show where she's trying to choose, what her best options are in dealing with going to her friend's party. These asides, I think, work really well, and I don't know if the purpose of them is to explore those issues. So if it felt more like that's what it was going for and it was coming up short, then I think I'd be on the same page. But when I watched Dollface, and I might have some recency bias because we've included this on the podcast because we had to postpone a day, and so I used that time to watch all of this. So I've only just seen it within the last 30 hours. I just think it's attuned to my style of comedy, I think, for one, and it plays off of the more serious moments in Dollface. So we get the Wizard of Oz episode as episode 9, and then episode 10 picks up where we're dealing with the aftermath of Jules telling Madison, this thing that she's seen about the partner that she's with, and the way that they juxtapose those worlds of the magical, realistic, and the normal is probably the long word, because there are a lot of exaggerated characters, especially Jules's co-workers. But I think it's done really well. I'd have to sit more on that, but for one, I think this is laugh out loud funny at points, and that's mostly from Izzy's character. That arc is, and the use of her is the absolute most that you could possibly ask out of a character in that position. In the same way that we were praising Patty Harrison for Ruthie, there's only so much that Ruthie's character is there for. There's only so much that Izzy's character is here for in Dollface, but she's so good at it that I think that this season would be worth watching just for that. But in dealing with friendships, it's such a important topic. So on paper, this could be very much a series that's really aiming low, I guess, in terms of creative aspiration, so it'd be easy to revel in the joy of this being a female-centric series that celebrates a lot of issues. That's not the right word. A lot of characteristics of femininity and challenges a lot of issues that a lot of females in these positions, especially in the workplace, deal with. And I don't think that it does that. I think that it takes its key theme of friendship and does so much justice to that if it has shortcomings in other areas, I'm willing to, I guess, look the other way because it represents the challenges of maintaining friendships in adult life so well.
Apologies if you hear background noise. My dog is barking in her sleep. She often does. Very active napper. Wizard of Oz episode is kind of the one I want to focus on because I watched that episode. I could see the conceit at the beginning. I was like, okay, I see what they're going for here. But once the episode ended, I didn't really know why it existed, or it just felt too clever by a half. Like, oh, we can put them in these costumes and we'll use the Women's March as the backdrop, and we'll have the, Oz be this feminist speaker who tells us that, feminism is kind of a shapeless thing that you can't really define. And it's all a dream sequence. And can you tell me what the point of that episode was? Because I watched it. I watched it actually very recently because you told me to watch it before we recorded this. And I sat with it for about 20 minutes after, and I'm like, I don't know why they did this. I just don't. And I mean, maybe it's just because I don't have the context. I missed a few episodes before that and haven't seen the whole picture. I get the whole conceit of her not wanting to reveal, sexual detail about her friend and her boss's husband and all that stuff. But I feel like the framing of it was like somebody thought about, like, oh, I could make a really funny melting joke about a tablet here, and we could have this thing about how, feminist leaders are sometimes pursuing messages that they can't actually define themselves and stuff. But I don't know if it had enough bite, and I wonder if it was the framing of it as a Wizard of Oz dream sequence that takes that bite away, or if I'm just a cold asshole. Could be the second. I'm not arguing that.
And it could be neither. I'll try to explain why I think that's such a good episode, and what the point of it was, which was to your question, actually. So, the point of it, think of it in terms of, again, here we go, bringing up this series every fucking week, Game of Thrones with its 10-episode weeks. And,
hey, ring the alarm.
And its 9th episode, event episodes for most of its season. A lot of those episodes were done in ways to relieve so much of the tension that had been building up for the 8 episodes prior, so that the finale could be devoted to just kind of getting everything ready to end and dealing with
organizing the notes, as one might.
Yeah, the falling resolution is maybe what you heard it called, in school. And I think by having it be this Wizard of Oz homage and this dream sequence, this whole season is based around the attempted rekindling of the friendship between Jules and Madison. Stella and Izzy are big cogs in this, of course. Stella more so in terms of storylines that the characters are given, but it's mostly about Jules and Madison. And here is this instance of Jules finally making an incredibly difficult decision, but doing the right thing by her friend, and her friend not being able to process it correctly. And probably because she's just not used to being in that situation with Jules, because she's been absent for so long. And so you kind of need this episode, which happens in the unconscious, to process that in a way where it's manageable. And when I messaged you, the word that I used was, it felt like it was reverse engineered. And I doubt that it actually was, but why I think it's so successful creatively is that that Jordan Weiss found this existing media or this existing structure that was so perfect for this cast and all of the storylines that they had been given up to this point. Stella being the Scarecrow equivalent, this character who applied to business school, didn't get in, and is just really having issues with wondering whether or not she is intelligent enough to be a part of the world that she wants to be. Obviously, Scarecrow equivalent. And they do the same thing with the Lion and the Tin Man, dealing with Izzy's lack of confidence. Like, it's a huge part, like the defining part of who she is. And Madison, all of that heart work going on with being torn between what to do now that she has this information and being genuinely hurt by the situation. That maybe is the least strong tie there. It's not exactly the Tin Man equivalent, but it's the one that makes the most sense. The way that at least those things fit so perfectly into that structure just really wowed me, and it meant that you could have fun with these other Wizard of Oz in jokes. And I think if you're not on board with it, then you're going to find those things just like a bit annoying, maybe.
A little hokey?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think because as I realized as it was happening and it just made so much sense that I was so on board with it that I even wanted more of that stuff, because it meant that they could have a lot of fun before moving on into a finale that really needs to address all of that hurt that's been going on.
Yeah, I think maybe having the context of the full season, like you had said off air, might help a little bit, because, there are 3 or 4 episodes in here that I haven't seen. Maybe that would help me enjoy the setting a little bit more, because I did the whole Wizard of Oz framing felt a little cutesy for me, and I think some of the jokes don't really land all that well. Like, the stuff around Celeste as the Wicked Witch is kind of nah, and even the show recognizes that when they're like, this is a little more wicked than Wizard of Oz. I don't know. It's a show that I need to invest some more time in and explore, because the premise of it obviously speaks to me. I'm a big fan of Kat Dennings. I'm an even bigger fan of Esther Povitsky, who's the one who plays Izzy. I should mention that if people are unfamiliar with her work, she actually has another Hulu series that ended a couple years ago. I think it was on, what's ABC Family called now? Freeform.
Freeform.
The fuck kind of name is that? She had a show, it's on Hulu still, called Alone Together, where she plays an up-and-coming comedian living with a rich kid in Beverly Hills that I think is pretty good. And I think it's actually, kind of a big star moment for her. She's really good on it. I don't know. It just all felt, from the costuming to the whole setting of it as a dream sequence, it separated me from the emotional connection that I was forming with some of the characters. And ultimately, the scene with Sylvia, I think, is the part where the stuff around it is not all that bad, but the stuff with Sylvia, the feminist who takes her eyelashes off and then whisks away to have a meeting with Dianne Feinstein is, I don't know, it looks towards making a judgment about a certain type of character that I think is a really cogent point to make, but I don't think that it just doesn't have enough bite to it for me.
Yeah, it might be the context, or it might just be the aesthetic and what this show is. I by far, I think that this is the least accessible of the 3 series that we're talking about, but only because of how stylized it is. So it's a case of either you get on with it or you find it abrasive in some ways. And it matched so well with me that I was so confused by a lot of the reviews. This has a Metascore of 54 from the critics, which, take that with less than a grain of salt, like whatever. But if I was a creative and this was my first project, like I'd at least be considering like the responses to that, and I would be a bit disappointed that it felt like that this wasn't seen and judged correctly. That maybe a lot of people thought that this was trying to do things that it wasn't. And I don't know. It felt like some of them were just superficial issues of something like the cat lady, like really coloring um, a lot of the opinion of how it uses magic realism. And I think, again, that's not done as well as some of the other ways that it deals with this world that's very different from ours. But so much of it, I think, is done incredibly well.
Yeah, there's two kind of last points. My partner has watched this show as well, and I was talking to her about it. And she said the thing that really drew her to the show was the idea of a series that finds truth and value in the importance of having a life outside of a relationship, which seems like a simple point, but is something that we see with our friends and colleagues all the time. People that just have these weird ticks in their relationship, like they constantly need to check in with each other, or there's a lack of confidence in the human being existing outside of that relationship. And I do think, from what I've seen, that this show has, partly by taking place after that relationship ends, has a strong point of view on that. One thing I wish I could give a better point of view on by A, having a better series, and B, being of a different sex than I am. This show has a lot of it is about female friendship and that interaction and the dynamics in those relationships. And I do wonder how effective it is at that. I went out of my way to look for a couple reviews written by females on this show, just out of curiosity. Most of the time when I look for reviews on a show, I look for, reviews written by people of color or women or queer people, just because it gives a perspective that I don't have as a boring ass white straight dude. And that seemed to be a big criticism that people found. It seemed like some of the secondary characters were hollow, and it made the relationships feel hollow. And I can't really speak to that. What I did see, it did feel like parts of it did rely on kind of cliched dynamics between female characters, but just because it is familiar and a cliche doesn't necessarily mean it's untruthful. So I just don't really think it's a thing I can speak to. So I don't really know why I'm talking about it. But when you mentioned the reviews, I did think of the reviews I read, and that was kind of the common thread, was that people seemed to feel like the relationships felt hollow, which I didn't really get that feeling, but there's a certain disconnect between myself and this series that I need to examine a little bit more before I can really have like a cohesive point of view on it.
Yeah, I mean, we both mentioned reviews, and I don't want to feel like we're sidestepping anything, so I'll take one of them to task at least, and it's going to be slightly out of context because this is kind of just the blurb that gets shown on Metacritic. But at RogerEbert.com, the blurb for Alison Shoemaker's review is, at best amusing, at worst infuriating comedy that misses far more than it hits. This is a great cast of women trapped in a series made by a bunch of obviously talented people who will almost certainly go on to make smart, funny, daring, and bold things. This being Dollface, isn't one of them. And taking issue with it, smart and funny, this season definitely is. Like, I don't...
Certainly bold. I mean, like you said, the first episode is so alienating to, a general television audience. And I think that in itself gives it a boldness that most series of this kind don't have. I mean, take Shrill, for example. Shrill could have gone this surrealist route. It'd be a totally different show, but it doesn't. It plays it a little bit safer by choice. And I think that outlandish nature of it gives it a personality that it wouldn't have of it.
I don't know if it's aiming to be daring. It just... the feeling that I got from reading other people write about it just made it seem like they wanted it to be a different show than it is, and to address certain issues more than it did, even though it was interested in kind of... It's a relatively light show, so compared to a lot of other things that we label as dramedies, it skews probably more on the comedy side than a lot of the other ones would. Like Rami, which we'll talk about at some point next month, does the drama so incredibly well that it doesn't need to be as comedic as it is, but it still is very funny. And I think this is the same thing, just in reverse, that this is both a very funny series and a really honest and more than just amusing. That was the quote, at best amusing, that began that blurb. It's more than that to me, because I think it does get at dynamics and friendships that are really meaningful, and it's done to me insightfully. And this is somebody looking at my male friendships and trying to get something out of it by watching something that deals with female friendships, and I still do get a lot out of it, because if there are not direct parallels, then there are indirect parallels that make me think while I'm watching, oh yeah, like I've been in a similar situation with one of my friends like that and have thought some of these things. And it's just that Dollface is less interested, I think, with that side of the stuff, and is more interested in being something a bit more creative, aesthetically, of course, because it does some things, like you said, that will put people off, but this is what it is. And also just being really funny. Like if we take this review and say, these people will go on to make smart, funny, daring, bold things, this isn't one of them. If you're saying that Dollface isn't funny, like, have you not been watching Esther Kvitsky in this role? Like, she's actually laugh out loud funny, and I'm not somebody who laughs out loud a lot, especially when I'm alone. Like, almost never when I'm watching something by myself. Like, it's usually if other people are in the room and they start laughing, I'm more inclined to laugh. But watching this by myself, I found myself laughing out loud. So maybe it's just a disconnect from the style of comedy, and that's fair enough. But everything that I think Dollface sets out to do, it does those things well, and it feels like if this is very much a show not aimed at the general audience, and so it's not going to please everybody, and that's fine. And I'm glad that Hulu has something like this on its bill.
I think you hint at something that I really want us to explore in depth on another show, but I do want to mention now. It's this idea, in this post kind of second golden age of television, or first golden age, however the fuck you want to define it. The post Mad Men, post Breaking Bad age that we're in now, is that a lot of critics, including myself at times, I've fallen privy to this, feel like every show needs to be the definitive show about something. If you are not the show that has the defining point of view on on one certain topic or another, then you're viewed as either listless or pointless. And I don't think that's fair. I think, like, when you hint that this is a bit of a lighter show in tone, I think that's fine. You can still have stuff that speaks to fundamental truths about human beings without having to be like the number one show about it, or the definitive source, or be the one that changes everybody's fucking mind about something. And I actually think there's value in shows that don't try to aim for that all the time. I think maybe that's how I need to go back and, when I fill in the gaps of the episodes I've seen, is how I need to view Dollface more. Is it is this one show about these group of people, and maybe it's not trying to be, the feminist screed of 2020 that everybody needs to read and watch or something like that. It's not the essay of the year or what have you. It is just a show about female characters and their relationships, and it can just be that and be okay. And be good, not just okay. It can be a good show.
When you promote this episode, you should tag the showrunner in it and invite her onto the podcast so we could talk with her about some of the stuff like that, because it would be good to have another perspective, especially one that's not male.
Yes, ladies, if there are any women listening to this and you want to be on the show, please come on the show. We're two dudes. We can only say so much.
We can. And it's usually, we have maybe about 40 minutes worth of good material, and the rest of it is just us, just failing miserably.
Swinging dick and balls around for no reason.
Yeah.
On that note, I think we have made it to the end of the show. Again, if you guys want to find us on the internet, Mid-Season Replacements, Google us, YouTube us, Internet us. Yeah, thanks for joining me, Sean. We'll be back next week to talk about... We're going to talk about USA Network in the post-Mr. Robot age, which means we're going to be talking about shows like Briar Patch and Dare Me and The Sinner, and we're going to try and figure out what USA wants to be as a brand now. Are characters still welcome? Let's find out. We will see you guys next week.